linebacker position group. So now moving on towards basketball again, really just it's all about the man defense, I think, because you can finally say that Hopkins is actually playing man-to-man defense instead of that 2-3 defense, 2-3 zone defense that he just loves from coming from Syracuse and being a Syracuse guy. I mean, it's taken over a month and a half, but I think Hopkins has finally realized that this 2-3 zone defense, it does not work with the current personnel and the current players that he has on the team. He simply doesn't have a zone defense team. What he has is a man-to-man defense team, and I might be willing to go out on a limb here and say that they're a pretty good man-to-man defense. Now, that might be a bit of a hot take, and there really is just such a small sample size of this. But looking into that small numbers before this past week, which I really think was the first time that Hopkins went all in on the man defense. They'd probably been practicing it for a week or so leading up to these games this week and really nailing it down. And then he implemented it and just stuck with it through the whole entirety of all three of these past games they played. But before those games, the Huskies were surrendering 79 points per game on average. And in the past three games, since they turned to the man-to-man defense for the whole 40 minutes, they surrendered 69 points, 64 points, and 63 points. And I get it that that's a very small sample size and just to take that with a grain of salt. But as it's not nearly as good of a number as the 17 games with 79 points per game. But then something else to really look into is the previous three times that the Huskies played the teams they played this past week in man-to-man defense. The first time the Huskies met USC was back January 14th. And at that instance, the Huskies were still just zone defense, full on, trying to just do it and run it into the ground, basically just failing over and over again. And so when the Huskies played USC back then, they gave up 95 points. Now, 95 points compared to 69 points is a huge difference and a huge improvement overall for the Husky defense. Looking into the last time they met UCLA before this past week, that was right along the January 14th time when they played USC before. So they were still all in on that zone defense, playing that for the entirety of the game. And against UCLA the first time, they gave up 81 points per game, or 81 points in that game. So you look, another huge improvement going from 81 points in the zone defense to only 64 points in the man-to-man defense, or 64 points in the man-to-man defense. And the final measure of that is against Wazoo, where when they first played Wazoo, it was only a couple of weeks ago. So they had started to kind of mix in that zone defense with the man-to-man defense. But still, it was still a transition and a work in progress, really, for the Huskies, as this might have been the first game that you could say they ran the zone for more, or ran the man defense for more than a couple possessions in a row. So they hadn't practiced it much and were not the best at it. And they ended up giving up 77 points against the Cougars in the first meeting. And now here in the second meeting, where they went just full on man-to-man defense, they gave up 63 points. And really after that first meeting with the Cougars on this show, I talked about the Huskies should look to continue to work that man-to-man defense in more and more and eventually kind of transfer to just running that. And Hopkins clearly did this, saw this. He'd been working on it in practice with the team, as there was a huge improvement from that game when they were in the man-to-man defense to these games against USC, UCLA, and Wazoo, where they were in it the whole time. Just continuously practicing that defense will only make them better at it. Now, even with this much improved defense, the Huskies still only went 1-2 this past week. And why is that, you ask? Well, I think it's as simple as the teams they played are just really good. You look at it as they played USC, USC is the number one team in the Pac-12. Then they played UCLA. Who's UCLA? Well, It might have been in a little slump there, but they're still the number 2 Pac-12 team for standing. So they played the number 1 team in the Pac-12 and the number 2 team in the Pac-12. So going into this past week, I said on last week's show that I wouldn't be shocked if the Huskies lose by 20 plus points and be blown out by both these schools. Now the Huskies ended up only losing by 3 to UCLA, so another close game against UCLA. The first time they met, they lost by 5, I believe it is. And against USC this week, they lost by 15. Another strong defensive outing for the Huskies, but a poor offensive showing, especially in that USC game. And that brings up really a key weakness for this Husky squad, and that's just scoring. To start the year, the Huskies had 2 issues: defense and offense. And when you have issues on defense and offense, you're obviously not going to have a good record. And that's what the Huskies have, a bad record. This is just their 4th win, I believe, on the year. And looking at the games against Colorado and Utah, that was those 2 games. The first time they played them, they played horribly. And then the second time they played Colorado and Utah 3 or so weeks ago, it was, I can't exactly remember. Their offense clicked in those games and they squeaked out 2 wins. Now, in order to win consistently, you can't just be good on one side of the ball. You have to be good on both sides, and you have to be able to make buckets with consistency, as well as stopping the opposing team from scoring, or you just won't win. It doesn't matter if you can effectively shut down your opponent offensively, as if your offense isn't very good, it's going to be very hard to win. That's why this past week, the Huskies' defense was strong, yet they only got 1 win, and that was against the Cougars, which they just squeaked by, winning 65-63. Now, the Huskies managed to win that with the poor offensive showing, shooting 42% from the field and 35% from deep. Their offense was clearly struggling, but that was an incident where the defense just barely made up for that and just managed to come out of that game with a win. And you can't rely on that from game to game. You just can't rely on your offense outscoring the other team's offense game out and game in, or your defense just shutting out the other team's offense. So really the best teams are always, or almost always, the most complete teams. And that works in just about any sport you play. The team that's the best is the team that can do it the best on both ends of it. Now, what the Huskies have to do is really figure out how to perform well both defensively and offensively, as they truly haven't done that in any game so far this year. So that'll be something to keep an eye on if the Huskies can keep this man-to-man defense going and keep performing well at it. If they can start finding their shot again, like they had that little glimpse they had a couple weeks ago where their offense was finally clicking. Now, getting into the last segment,